I'm Jerry Gordon, the senior editor at the New English Review, and we have an honored guest interviewing part of a, frankly, amazing family. His name is none other than Matthew Hausman. His brother, Rabbi John Hausman, is someone we've actually interviewed for the New English Review. And the family relationships go back to the fact that we were members of the same synagogue in Fairfield, Connecticut, Congregation Bethel, as it turns out. Why don't you give them some benefit of how intriguingly different your family background is from the average Jewish American family?
Well, the first distinction I would suppose is to say that I take umbrage when I hear the word Jewish American. I would say American Jew. Jew is the noun. American is the adjective, which I respect and I love, but I never lose sight because of the way I was raised about what I am and who I am. We got that from our parents and our grandparents. My parents, unlike many of their contemporaries, were not devotees of the Democratic Party. They tended to affiliate Republican when they affiliated, but they didn't always affiliate. They were either independent, which in Connecticut actually is a party. So I would say registered unaffiliated, which is Connecticut slang for independent, or Republican, but never Democrat. And that went back to not just the World War II era, but to my grandparents. My grandparents on both sides were immigrants. My mother's father remembered the revolutionary fervor in Russia and the Ukraine when he left. He had little tolerance for anything that he thought was either close to socialism or sympathetic to it, or could, I think, lend itself to it. In terms of his Yiddish newspapers, he read, I think, Der Tag back in the day, because the Foverts was a socialist newspaper. That grandfather, he was from a shtetl village in the Ukraine called Vrasholovka. Religious people. He went to the Slobodka Yeshiva, which those who know from the yeshiva world will have heard of. He never finished because he was pulled back to go into the family business. His wife, my grandmother, was from another shtetl around there. They were Hasidic people. So they came from a bent that, I don't want to say it was anti-enlightenment, but if you knew the complexion of the Jewish community in Europe at the time, you were, you could be today, I suppose, what would be called Haredi or ultra-Orthodox, whether that meant you were Hasidic or from the Litvish yeshiva world or whatever, or you could have been in support of the Enlightenment, which usually puts you in the secular camp, and ultimately it gave rise to, I think, in many ways, some of the movements we have today. The non-traditional movements, let's say. I don't want to offend anybody unnecessarily, although I'm a lawyer and a writer, so I suppose I offend people. That's part of what my job is. So that was sort of their philosophical environment. My father's father was from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, very religious. And my grandmother, his wife, funny thing is, an aside, my father there were 6 boys in the family. He had 5 brothers. And they were always told that their mother was born on this side. Why? Because it was a shan that was ashamed to be the children of immigrants. So they always said that my grandmother, who spoke perfect English, was born in New Jersey. So my brother, years later, and I never knew those grandparents. My grandmother died before my father married, and my grandfather died when I was an infant, which is starting to be a long time ago. But at a family funeral, Jonathan, who was doing he was the family historian, and he was doing a family tree. He asked my Aunt Frances, who was the matriarch on the Hausman side. She was my grandmother's last surviving sibling out of 10 sisters, 9 or 10 sisters. And Jonathan said to my Aunt Frances, can you tell me what town in New Jersey my grandmother was born in? And she just started laughing and said, "You don't believe that, Bubba Meisa, do you?" John said, "What do you mean?" She said she was born in Judenplatz in Vienna in the Jewish ghetto. She said they lied and told your father and his brothers that she was born here so they wouldn't think they were children of two greenhorns, you know? So, but that said, they were from extremely religious stock, which if you didn't give up being religious in this country, you weren't really, you didn't cotton to the Democratic platform, the New Deal platform, as it were, for many reasons. But I think the real reason was those Jews who were drawn to it were the ones who dropped their tefillin in the harbor when they saw the Statue of Liberty and gave up Shabbos. So they philosophically weren't part of that world. And during the World War II era, they hated Roosevelt because despite again, the myth that people think no one knew about the camps until, you know, they were liberated. That's just not true. As you know, Jerry, from your writings and your research. And read David Wyman's fantastic book, The Abandonment of the Jews. I mean, it says it all. And Professor Wyman, I mean, his history is impeccable. They didn't like Roosevelt for that reason. Everybody knew what was going on. He refused to lift immigration restrictions so that many more people died than otherwise, you know, would have. He refused to bomb the rail lines to the camps, claiming that they couldn't, among other things, sacrifice war material, and yet they sent platoons of troops gallivanting across Europe to rescue great works of art. So apparently great works of art, I'm not minimizing the importance of art, but apparently paintings and sculptures by dead artists were more important than living people who could have been saved. So both sets of grandparents couldn't stand Roosevelt. And as a consequence, that's the way my father held, and so did my mother. The interesting thing is not all of my father's brothers felt that way. Some were, you know, typical Northeastern Jewish Democrats. But my father never gave, nor did my mother. And interestingly enough, of all my father's siblings, he was the only one, well, one other brother who maintained a real Jewish, you know, household with any semblance of Yiddishkeit. Out of 6 brothers, only 2 of them maintained that kind of household. And my father always said he couldn't stand a Jew who wanted to pass. That was his litmus test. If you wanted to pass, then you know, weren't good dinner company.
Let's deal with your mother, who, by the way, I used to attend Minions daily with. She was live at Bethel. One of the discoveries we made after her demise and cleaning out her place was she had programs from the famous, I would say, famous pageants that were organized by the Bergson Group.
We Shall Not Die, written by Ben Heck. Yep.
Correct. And they were very interesting. Credit your brother for getting a facsimile copy, of which I have a treasured one as well. But how did she get into these? She went to see, what was it, 2 of them, one in Philadelphia and one in New York?
Madison Square Garden, yeah. Well, her parents, again, they politically swung that way. Interestingly enough, my grandmother and grandfather didn't agree on everything politically. I mean, you know, broad strokes they did, but when I was interviewing my grandmother a few years before she died as a family journalist, I was recording her stories and asking her questions. And one time when I ran out of material, I just said, "When's the first time you voted for president? Can you tell me everyone you voted for?" And she told me every single one, you know. Did you vote the same as Grandpa? And then she told me about some of the knockout dragouts they had over. So she was not a shtetl hen, as they say. But they were again very traditional. What my grandmother wasn't Hasidic when she came to this country, because they ended up in just a non-Hasidic community. So you are as the community is, I guess. But politically, everything was about the Jewish people. My grandmother, I remember her vividly reading the obituaries and, hearing her cluck her tongue when she saw a Jewish name in the obits. But very ethnocentric. And I don't say that in a bad way. I think it's good to be proud of what you are and where you came from. So they were drawn more towards Jewish political groups, if you will, that if they weren't religious themselves, they were conducive to it. For example, the Revisionists, it was by no means an orthodox group, the Revisionist Zionists who broke off from the Zionist Congress. But as Jabotinsky said, and Jabotinsky, the founder of the Revisionists, who was not religious himself, he said, if religion is going to dictate culture in Israel, in the state of Israel, or in the Jewish state, when it will be so declared, it's going to have to be by the rabbis, because that's authentically Jewish. My grandfather was a revisionist. My grandmother was a revisionist. My grandfather met Jabotinsky when he came to the Northeast and he was raising funds. My grandfather said he was fascinating. How long their conversation was, I don't know, but it was long enough for them to go from English to Russian to Ukrainian to Yiddish to Hebrew. My grandfather was fluent in all those spoken languages. And my grandfather said it was just amazing. So he was a devotee of Jabotinsky. So if you were in that camp, then you were a supporter of Peter Bergson, aka Hillel Kook, in Ben Hecht. They were trying to not just raise funds during the war, but they were trying to raise awareness of the Holocaust. So Ben Hecht, who was a playwright and Hollywood scriptwriter, wasn't the most constant Jew, let's say, in his personal life, but Jewish nationalism spoke to him and it brought him back in a way. And he was very devoted to the cause. So they wrote this show called We Shall Not Die. And it played in most major North American cities, I believe. Again, Philadelphia, New York. It played up in Canada, Montreal, I believe, maybe Toronto. And my mother is a 14 or 15-year-old. She was sent to the show in New York with a contingent, I suppose, of kids. They didn't have, well, I guess they did have BBYO back then, but youth group wasn't the same as people consider it today, I suppose. But she went and she was part of the cause. She was a Bergson girl, my grandfather called her. So she went to the show in New York, and then my grandmother's sister and brother-in-law and nephew lived in Philly. So they sent my mother down to Philadelphia to go see it when it played in Philly. And to get to Philadelphia, went by train, which in the day probably took 7 or 8 hours. Or you can go by car, which was the Boston Post Road. There was no I-95. So that was quite a trip. But my mother went down there, and I think, I'm not sure, Jerry, the program you have, was it from the Philadelphia one? I think it was from the Philadelphia one, yeah, because my uncle worked in a printing company that printed the programs down there.
Now, you have another connection with the movement to apprise Americans of the Holocaust, and that was a local rabbi in
Rabbi Moshe Epstein was one of my rabbis. He was a Mir Yeshiva guy. He was a personal student of Rav Moshe Feinstein. For those who know from traditional Judaism, Reb Moshe, as we call him, was the single greatest posek or legal decisor of the 20th century. Rabbi Epstein, my rabbi, was a personal student of his. And Rabbi Epstein's father was a contemporary of Reb Moshe's father, and Rabbi Epstein's father was part of the Rabbis' March in 1943, the Rabbis' March on Washington. And I don't have to tell you the history, Jerry, but there were 350 rabbis, maybe 400, who were Old World Orthodox rabbis. Some of them couldn't speak English so well. They marched on Washington because they wanted to raise awareness, and they wanted really to spur the administration on to doing something. So what did Roosevelt do? Well, he was advised by his assimilated, acculturated Jewish advisors to ignore them. And when they made it to Washington and the White House, Roosevelt was spirited out of one of the back doors like a breeze in the night and refused to meet with them. Roosevelt knew what kind of Jew he liked, and it wasn't one who looked like a Jew, identified like a Jew, or ate like a Jew. It was one who looked like he could have joined the country club and aspired to be like, any other Gentile American. And I'm not saying that assimilating in American culture is a bad thing. What I'm saying is you don't have to give up what you are to be part of this fabric. But, you had multiple generations of Jews from the late 1800s through the 1900s, and I would submit even to today, who think that they want to get as far away from their heritage as possible because for a lot of reasons. Some of it's pathological, some of it's, I suppose, logistic. Some of it is not pathological, but it doesn't mean anything to them. It means, getting ahead by denying what you are. People are willing to do that. My grandparents weren't like that. These rabbis who marched on Washington certainly weren't like that. But I think looking back to that chapter in American Jewish history, it shows you a tension, I think, that we're seeing play out today with really toxic ramifications. We are finding assimilated Jews, these days politically progressive, who aren't content not to be Jewish. They don't want anybody to be Jewish. They're anti-Israel. And basically, I'd submit also anti-Jewish values. Now, that said, a lot of it has to do with progressivism. If you take a look back, at the two of the largest banes of the progressive existence when progressivism started in earnest, they didn't believe in nationalism, right? That was an evil, and religion was an evil. So in the Jew, they had the avatar of everything they hated. They had a people who refused to renounce their heritage, even though the majority, not all, but the majority had been living in exile. They refused to renounce Jewish nationhood, and they certainly refused to renounce Jewish religion. Now, interestingly enough, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're the only group that is an ethno-religious identity. You're not a Jew because it's a style. It's not something you put on. Certainly people can join the Jewish people, and it has happened. But basically our obligations are based on our heritage. The majority of us, there's a genome. You don't get genetic diseases based on what you believe, but your heritage does have within it, I think, certain essential obligations, and I think it certainly is true with us. So in the 18th and 19th century, the progressive movements didn't like the Jew because, again, we represented everything they didn't like. Voltaire hated us. Proudhon, the French utopians, the German socialists, the Austrian socialists. The right wing wasn't good to us either, by the way. But what happened is, I think there was a false sense when Jews came to this country, or when the offer of citizenship was finally there, because Jews weren't citizens of most of the nascent countries when they started to coalesce, and certainly weren't citizens of the world. In order to join, you had to give up. And Moses Hess, are you familiar with Moses Hess? He found this out. Many people don't know this. Everybody knows Marx and Engels, right? The Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital. But what they don't know is it was originally a writing, an intellectual triumvirate. It was Marx, Engels, and Hess. Hess is the one who taught Marx and Engels dialectical materialism. He's the one who taught them Hegelian philosophy. Hess was probably the original communist. So what happened? One of the reasons Hess did this, and you could read in his writings, he thought the plight of the Jew would be ameliorated by these new movements that were casting off the despotic, mentality. He thought that would be the salvation of the Jew. By the 1850s, he realized that wasn't true. He realized that the anti-Semitic element, that was exhibited by the despots and what we would call the right today, although it really wasn't that at the time, was not political. It was part of the culture, as part of European culture. So what happened to Hess? He never ceased being an economic progressive, but he withdrew from the movement. He wrote Roman Jerusalem in 1855, which was a quarter of a century before Herzl wrote Der Judenstaat. And basically, if you put them side by side, that really is what Herzl was saying. And the interesting thing too is Herzl was a secularist, certainly. People don't know the word Baba Misa. I apologize. It means, grandmother's tale.
Freely grandmother's tale.
Yeah. Well, one of the great Baba Misas of the Zionist movement is that Herzl was this secularist who had no connection to that's nonsense. Herzl's grandfather was a follower of Yehuda Alkali, who was one of the mystics who was known as a proto-Zionist. He gave him money. He was a supporter. So, but the thing is, Herzl, I honestly think he didn't know from Moses Hess, because when he found out about Roman Jerusalem, he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing, he wouldn't have had to write the Jewish state because the book had already been written. But the fact of the matter is, Hess had to come through this milieu, this furnace, to see that it wasn't political, it was European. And, I think a lot of Jews from the Sephardic lands, and the Teimanim and the Mizrahim probably found the same thing. They were living a ghetto existence as well. So again, this isn't particular to the left, but because the left is ascendant today and Israel has become a peccadillo for the left, very often you find the left these days voicing these noxious opinions about Jews. And if you take a look at U.S. law enforcement statistics, where do most hate crimes against the Jews come from? They're not coming from the right. The Proud Boys, okay, they're nasty and neo-fascists, certainly not nice people, but it's coming from the left, and it's coming from the identity communities that are supported by the left.
Can I stop you there for a second?
Sure.
Much of what you're talking about is the background for what has occurred, erupted, particularly in the last 15 years, rampant anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
Let's deal with an actual event concerning you. You were effectively the victim, if you want to call them that, of anti-Semitic address.
I wouldn't say victim. I don't like victimhood, victimization. No, the incident you're referring to, Jerry, is my son and I have 3 kids, 2 daughters and a son. My son was visiting from his home in New York, and we were walking home from shul, synagogue on Saturday. And you remember the area on Park Avenue and
yes,
Fairfield on one side, Bridgeport on the other. We're walking through what any old Bridgeporter still calls 90 Acres Park, although I think it's probably got 15, 20 acres today. We were set upon by a convertible full of college kids. There are a bunch of local colleges around here who were shouting anti-Semitic epithets at us. Shrug it off. I mean, this happened to us a lot when we were kids, and we got into a lot of fights when we were kids. I'm certainly not going to get in a fight with a car full of 20-year-olds. So my son and I, we talked about it. It was so stereotypical, it was almost comical. We walked through and I'm not saying anti-Semitism is comical, but the comments were so stereotypical. It was like, don't you have any originality? So we cut through the park, and as luck would have it, when we came through the other side of the park, the same car came down that road. They started up again. And you don't bite because sometimes fighting is necessary, and I've done it, and Jonathan has done it, and sometimes it's just, it's a distraction. So they had their fun and they drove off. And then as we turned the corner, because we live in Trumbull, Jerry, so we have to walk through Bridgeport, Fairfield, Trumbull to get home. It's only 3 miles, but it's like crossing 3 state lines. And as we turned onto one of the side roads off of Madison Avenue in Bridgeport that goes up to Trumbull, we were set upon by a pickup truck with a number of people in it who pulled over. They felt it necessary to shout anti-Semitic epithets at us as well. How did they know what we were? Well, my son is actually extremely frum, very Orthodox. He wears long tzitzit. We obviously had our kippas on, our yarmulkes. And if you're walking someplace when it's very hot, it was very hot, or it's very cold and it's a Saturday, they kind of know why you're not driving. And I wrote about it. It was I wrote about it as the backdrop for an article in Israel National News. And the point of the article was the Democratic Party would have you believe that anti-Semitism is the Proud Boys and it's all coming from the right. Well, no, it's not. This convertible full of kids was multi-ethnic and multiracial. The pickup truck, they were speaking Spanish. I mean, my point is they weren't, proud Aryans who tried to set upon a couple of Jews. They pretty much showed that anti-Semitism certainly doesn't know a specific ethnicity and certainly doesn't know a specific race. And you don't see this written about because it's not the narrative that they wish to peddle. Barry Weiss, when she was still working for I think it was Barry who wrote this article, but a couple of years ago, somebody wrote about the minority that experiences more hate crimes than anybody in New York, and it's Jews. And I read it at the time, and I haven't read it since. And it had to be her because I don't know who else at the Times would have written it. If it's not and it's somebody else, I apologize. But what the article said was, it's not commonly reported because it doesn't fit the narrative that the mainstream media, my word, not theirs, wishes to portray. Now, the interesting thing, the devastatingly, element about this that was just so out of character was that I was reading this in the New York Times. The New York Times has been printing anti-Semitic drivel for years. They call it, anti-Israel. They call it political, but let's not forget this is a new newspaper that its online edition has been guilty of running a number of classically anti-Semitic cartoons that look like they could have come from Der Stürmer. This is happening. This is a bastion of liberal journalism. So the point of that was, our experience was, we weren't set upon by Nazis. We weren't set upon by working class white people. We were set upon by a multi-ethnic crowd spread across a couple of cars. And when ultimately the local press picked up on it, because it was the subject of some discussion at a Chabad event that had a journalist or two who write about anti-Semitism, they asked if anybody experienced anti-Semitism. Of course, we did as kids all the time. It was not unusual, but it was recent. So when they picked it up, they didn't mention my name because I didn't give my name. It wasn't germane to the discussion we were having with these journalists. So they picked it up as this attorney was walking home one Saturday from synagogue with his young son in tow. My young son was 29 or 30. But so they got part of it right. We were set upon by anti-Semites, but the rest of it, they got 100% wrong.
Matt, you have a dual career as both a journalist specializing in health, science, and medicine stuff, but you also have had a mentor who you've spoken about proudly because he gave you your moral compass when it comes to appreciating what good journalism is all about. And I wonder if you could talk about him and
Sure.
then what his suggestion was.
Sure. His name was Vernon Merritt III. And if he was a photojournalist during the 60s and 70s, he was in Time Life Saigon Bureau during the Vietnam War. He covered the civil rights movement here. And if anybody's old enough to remember, and I'm dating myself, there were a number of famous covers and photos in Life magazine. One was a portrait of Coretta Scott King after Dr. King was assassinated. Stunning photo. It's still sold as a poster today. There were, as I mentioned to you, Jerry, the other day, the pictures of helicopters being thrown off aircraft carriers at the end of the Vietnam War.
Right.
Those were Vernon's photos. Vernon got into it. He was shot in Vietnam. He was shot in the spine. He was expected to be a paraplegic, but fortunately the nerve damage wasn't irreparable, and he did recover. But when I met him, he was producing Science, Health, and Medical magazines. And I had an editor who quit at lunchtime one day. So Vernon found himself having to fill in for the editor. Well, he started editing my work and he liked what he saw. He told me, and I'll never forget, and I still don't know what it means. He said I had a voice, and I honestly don't know how you get that, but he said, anything I write, he can tell that I wrote it because it sounds like the way I talk without dumbing it down. So anyway, so we became very close, and Vernon was probably, I guess he was old enough to be my father if, he had a child when he was a sophomore in college. And I learned a lot about journalism. Well, we used to talk about a lot of things. Everything. He was a baseball fan. He was a student of history. And at some point he started asking me about the Arab-Israeli crisis, as it was called in those days. And as I wrote about a week or so ago, he asked me why so many of the activists and Jewish journalists he knew from the 60s turned against Israel after the Six-Day War. Part of it had to do with, in their narrative, Israel was no longer David, Israel was now Goliath. And, they bought into a whole national narrative that forgetting about its revisionism, it became part of the progressive and the liberal agenda. So, we had a dialogue about this for the next 15 years or so. But he told me that, because he realized, and that was the jumping off point for what he taught me afterwards. I was talking about how these journalists, the Jews among them who were journalists, they had a platform, and they were using that platform to prostitute their particular agenda, their views. I told Vernon a lot of stuff they wrote was just ahistorical, and he did his research and he agreed with me. I gave him things to read. He was old enough to be my dad, but he listened, he read, and we had discussions. So he told me at one point, and Vernon was a Southern gentleman. He was born and raised in Alabama, not an ounce of Jewish blood in his veins, but he told me, he said, this is something you're passionate about. He said, as good of a writer as I think you are, writing about things you're not passionate about, how much more so for the stuff that really means something to you. And he told me, he said, you should be writing commentary. He said, however, commentary to be effective should be based on fact. Your opinion can be whatever it is, but those facts better be correct. And he told me there's more truth to fact-based commentary than there is to advocacy journalism. And, when I started writing about this, I wrote the odd article about, the Middle East and Jewish issues and stuff, but I was also writing a lot about science, health, and medicine and business. I had a legal column in a national magazine for a number of years, but I didn't focus on it exclusively. And I think, and Vernon died in a very bizarre and tragic gun accident in the year 2000. If Vernon saw what I was writing today, I think he would be as proud of me as if I were his own kid. And he took an interest in me, I think, because none of his kids were interested in journalism. So he was sort of my surrogate and he was my mentor, but I learned from him, I think, certain truths that you don't learn in school. You don't learn them by reading the New York Times. You don't learn them by listening to CNN. And frankly, even for those outlets that still report honestly, you don't necessarily learn it there either. You have to have somebody who believes it, who's lived it, and has experienced it, and can pass it on to you. It's not like smicha from a rabbi, but I felt almost like I was anointed by somebody who was gifted. And believe me, I'm not gifted. But if I did anything since then that he could take pride in, then I did something right in spite of myself.
You and your brother are on a broadcast weekly, I think even more frequently than that, which originates out of where? Toronto, Canada. It's called the
Toronto,
Zelda
yep.
Young Show. And I guess the station call number is kind of interesting. It's CHIN. That's pretty easy to remember. And it's apparently it's got listeners in places like Australia, probably here in the US, maybe even in Israel. It reminds me a lot of what I was doing with my former partner, Rod Bryant, on Israel News Talk Radio Beyond the Matrix, where we had credible listeners all over the globe in that regard.
Yeah.
But in any instance, how did that start, both you and for John?
Well, John met Zelda, I believe, might have been at a Kufi thing up in Canada. That could be where it started with him. And he was on periodically. And then in 2013, in response to Israel Apartheid Week, which was metastasized all over North America, a group up there put together what they called Israel Truth Week. And they had read my stuff in Israel National News and other publications. And they, of course, knew Jonathan because he's, but before the pandemic, he was a very sought after speaker, and he'd been up there a number of times. So they invited us both up. I was the keynote speaker the first night. John was the keynote speaker the second night. They had maybe 20 speakers, and they had Israeli military people. They had one or two diplomats, rather. They had some former Islamic scholar. Well, I mean, he's still a scholar. Former anti-Semite who grew up in Pakistan, who, you know, when he was able to take off those blinders and partake of Western society, actually got to know Jews beyond what the Quran and the Hadith might teach. He found out that, you know, something, these people have a lot to offer. So Zelda heard that John had a brother and said, geez, do you think he'll be on my show? So we weren't in studio, but she did it by phone. So I was sitting in whatever host had put us up. I was sitting in their living room talking to Zelda for the first time. And I think that was in December of 2013. And then she started having me on every time I had something published. She would want to schedule me. And then it turned into, I guess, John and I seemed to be good for their listeners. So she asked me at some point if I would take a weekly spot. And I said, yeah. And that's grown into twice a week. I'm on Sunday mornings and Wednesday mornings, and Jonathan is on Tuesday mornings.
That is essentially how I spent close to 4 years on Israel News Talk Radio Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant. I was invited on for a couple of shows, and then suddenly I found myself, when his former partner left him, basically becoming producer and co-host. And it was a fabulous relationship in that regard. There's a issue out there, I think, that I'd like to see you address if I could.
Sure.
And it does concern what's happening presently in Israel. And it's a reflection of rejection, essentially, of the basic facts of Jewish heritage and legacy in the Holy Land. And the telling point was on the first day of Hanukkah in 2021, there's a new president of Israel, Mr. Herzog, lighting the first candle where? In Hebron. And the question is, why was he doing this? Well, The Herzog family, I guess his grandfather, was the Grand Rabbi of Ireland and the UK for a number of years.
And he was a chief Ashkenazi rabbi after independence in 1948. Yep.
That's correct. And the second reason was that, the cave of the patriarchs, the Machpelah, essentially is revered by Jews all over the world. Mm-hmm. Troy, who I admire, said this about the Hebron event: "It is depressing to watch some Jews embrace every claim every Palestinians make while ignoring basic history truths. Why are American Jews, especially amongst the millennials, abandoning support for the Jewish nation itself?"
Well, you can't start with the millennials. You have to start with their parents and grandparents. The connection to Yiddishkeit, to Judaism, is attenuated. Look, you daven, you pray where you're comfortable, but the bottom line is the non-traditional movements have been horrible educationally. You take a look at the fact that since the year 2000, 73% of all Jewish marriages outside of Orthodoxy have been intermarriages. Might even be higher. And the reason for that is that Pew study, Jewishness was self-reported. If you're part of the Reform movement and your father's Jewish and your mother's not, then you're not Jewish under the law. So frankly, you have a lot of people who are marrying Jews who themselves are not Jews. There was a, and this goes back before the 1960s. I mean, this has been going on. I mentioned the Enlightenment earlier. This is, where the rabbis who were very, very wary of the Enlightenment, this ultimately is why they were wary of it. Jews no longer found it essential to learn Jewish history. Jews no longer found it relevant to learn the language of their ancestors. We learned conversational Hebrew as kids, and that was, I think, a turning point. They basically threw us into classes with Hebrew-speaking teachers who didn't speak to us in English. And when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, you pick it up pretty quickly. That was unusual. That didn't happen in Talmud Torahs at the time. For the most part, that was over with. If you don't know the language, you can't access your heritage. You can't access your sacred text. So what have they done? They've substituted other values. If you go to any Reform synagogue and the Democratic Party and liberal values are synonymous with Judaism. Now, I'm not saying if you're Jewish, you have to be liberal, conservative. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, if you know Jewish values and they've been inculcated in you, then you can make politically whatever decisions you want about whatever issue for whatever reason, but you can't say, I'm doing this because it's the Jewish thing to do. Look, there are some liberal values that are very consistent with Jewish values, but there are a lot of conservative values that are. But for generations, everybody was taught to believe, and this is where my parents were different, that to be a Jew is to be a Democrat, to be a Jew is to be a liberal, to be a Jew. That's not what it's about. That's never what it's been about. And unfortunately, you have millennials who were raised by parents themselves who didn't learn Jewish values. I mean, the gap and the void goes back in some cases 10 generations, Jerry. And the fact that a lot of these people continued to marry Jewish, it was just happenstance because the communities probably had more Jews than not. But the fact of the matter is, you take the Jew out of the community, and if he has no connection to his past or his sacred literature, and if all the being Jewish is to him is the Holocaust and Tay-Sachs disease, that's not all it's about, and so that's what we're seeing. I don't blame the millennials themselves. They were taught horribly. And unfortunately, in some of the non-traditional movements, you have rabbis who don't know. And again, I'm not casting aspersions on individuals. I know a lot of dedicated people who are dedicated to the Jewish people across movements, but it's more common the more left-wing you go ritually, to adopt that political agenda as a Jewish value, when it's just nonsense, because some parts of the progressive agenda these days are not only anti-Israel, they're anti-Semitic. And yet you have Jews themselves who are, shilling for these. I mean, you take a look at what we have in Congress. I'm no fan of what's her name, the Republican, Green. I mean, she said some reprehensible things. But on the other hand, she was condemned. The squad says anti-Semitic stuff almost on a daily basis. And are they censured? Are they punished? No. They're rewarded with prestigious committee appointments. And finally, and I wrote about this and I got some pretty nasty responses to it, but finally, you had 12 Democratic congressmen and women who finally came out and condemned some of the things that Omar and I think Tlaib had said. Now, how many Jews are there in Congress, Jerry? 36 or 38 maybe.
37,
First
I
of
think.
all, why did it take them almost 2 years to finally call out their anti-Semitism? And why was it only 12 Jews? Because they're supporting them, because I guess, I don't know why. I mean, it's again, I think it's pathological. But for a Jew not to see that these comments are in fact anti-Semitic, you take a look at Omar's comments that occasioned a resolution to condemn anti-Semitism. Well, the Democrats couldn't get enough Democrats to support it. They couldn't muster the support when it was about anti-Semitism and when it called out specific comments made by her. It was only when they dumbed it down into a general resolution against all hatreds, that it finally passed. But it was no longer a resolution against anti-Semitism, and it ignored the reason why it was necessitated in the first place. Why aren't the Jews speaking up as Jews? Because you could be damn sure if it was a Republican who said some of these things, like what's her name, Congresswoman Green, they'd be all over, and rightly so, by the way. But it's got to go both ways. And I suppose the difference in mindset can be characterized this way. The late William F. Buckley, when he finally realized that he had a couple of people on his editorial board, they were writing vilifications of Israel on the pages of the National Review. You know who I'm talking about.
Yes, I do.
Buckley finally took a look and said, something, this really is anti-Semitic. As you recall, these individuals were kicked off the editorial board of the National Review, and he wrote a feature-length article called In Search of Anti-Semitism that he turned into a book. And if you've ever read the book also has essays contributed by people as diverse as Buckley himself and Dershowitz. Now, what was the significance? I mean, I think Buckley got some of the history wrong. I can't blame him for that. I mean, it was not his forte. But what happened is in 1993, they had a come to God meeting, as it were. They realized, and Buckley admitted, how much of a fixture anti-Semitism was in the political landscape, in the cultural landscape, in the religious landscape. And for him to say that as Roman Catholic was pretty telling. So he writes a book on it, to try to start the rectification process. That's really what tikkun means, not what the conservative reform movement's called tikkun olam. That's nonsense. That's left-wing repository for whatever they're into. I mean, real tikkun, real rectification is actually something that Buckley tried to do. Now, what happened is, since then, even before then, which party has voted pro-Israel more often? The Republican Party. Trump, like him or hate him, he made fighting anti-Semitism, combating anti-Semitism a priority of the State Department, an agency which itself had been anti-Semitic since at least the Roosevelt years. If you want to find people who are condemning anti-Semitism, it's not coming from the Democratic side of the aisle. Since then, the Democrats have had multiple occasions to do the same thing. They could have used, the squad's ramblings as a watershed moment. They could have used the Obama administration's gross anti-Israel extremism as a rallying point. They could have used, Resolution 2334, which was coordinated by the Obama administration on the way out they coordinated this UN resolution that they agreed in advance not to veto. And what does it say, among other things? Well, the Jews have no historical connection to Judea and Samaria. The temple never stood in Jerusalem. The Wiesenthal Center called that, I think, one of the most significant acts of international anti-Semitism of 2016. Where were these Democrats who could have written a book like Buckley did, or at least a magazine article, or at least said something about it? They've had a good dozen instances where they could have done the same thing that Buckley did in 1993, and they punted every time.
Before we went on this program, we were talking about a piece you wrote about what constitutes a righteous Gentile.
Mm-hmm.
You were making a distinction about the basic concept of the Gerai Teshuvah, those who follow the Noahide commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this personally because Rod Bryant is a Noahide. Noahide who basically converted over from evangelicalism.
Yep.
And in fact, his life change story is up for everybody to see on the Nativ.
I've watched it. It's captivating.
Yeah, very captivating.
One of the rabbis there, by the way, Aryeh Wolbe, he used to be, he was the Rosh Kollel in Bridgeport. He was my chavrusa about 15, 16 years ago. Lovely guy, by the way.
So what then is your objection to elements inside the evangelical movement?
I have no problem with evangelicals who support Israel for the right reasons. I have a big problem with those who do it for the wrong reasons. And I know a lot of evangelicals. I certainly know a lot through my brother, but when you're a Jew who knows Jewish scripture in the original, you get asked a lot of questions. And I've done a lot of education. That's not I am an adjunct professor, but that's criminal justice. It's not Jewish stuff. But if I say to somebody, do you believe in replacement theology? No, I think that's horrible. Well, good, because that's theological anti-Semitism. That's fine. For some people, the questioning stops there. For me, it doesn't. Then I say, why do you support Israel? Do you believe that you have to support Israel so that the Jews will all go there and will all ultimately be converted in the end of days? And if they say that, to me, that's the wrong reason. Now, I know plenty who don't believe it. I know plenty who used to believe that, but no longer do. Where it breaks down, in my experience, Jerry, people have to be open to certain things, and they have to be open to not new ideas, but old ideas. For those who talk about the Bible, for example, we all believe in the same Bible. We don't. We don't believe in the Christian Bible. There's a saying that counter missionaries have that they say, is there true stuff in Christian scripture? And some, and you probably know some of these rabbis say, yeah, but anything that's true isn't new, and anything that's new isn't true. We go back to our scripture to, check these things out. When you take a look at what, for example, if you don't mind me giving an example, I got into a discussion with a client of mine who I think honestly was trying to convert me until he realized he couldn't out-Jew me. And I talked about some of the differences. He said, are they significant? I said, yeah. He said, they are. I said, he said, give me an example. I said, Psalm 2, verse 12, what does it say? He knew exactly what he thought it said. He said, it says, kiss the son, lest he be angry. Well, when you read it in Hebrew, it doesn't say that at all. The word nashku bar, they translate as kiss the son. Nashku, neshek, and neshika could mean kiss, but it could also mean to arm oneself. And what it says, and bar does not mean son in Hebrew, it means purity. It says, arm yourself with purity, lest he be angry. And I gave my friend Mark and also a grammar lesson. If you wanted to say kiss the son, as opposed to kiss a son, you would have to have the definite article et and ha. Anyway, but it sort of opened up his eyes, and he started reading. He's actually having his kids taught Hebrew. And he said, what do you think about that? And I told him, I said, be careful what you wish for. I said, I don't know where your journey is taking you. And wherever it takes you, I said, you're still my friend. Now that you're not trying, to get a scalp on your belt. But, be careful, because if your kids start reading the Hebrew scripture in the original and they see what it really says, they're going to find out that some of the things that you guys teach about it. And by the way, my friend Mark has had a conversion of sorts. He doesn't believe any of that stuff. And he's an ardent supporter of Israel for the right reasons, for reasons of history and justice. If you support me and my ancient homeland for reasons of history and justice, then I don't have a problem. But if there is an ulterior motive, and that motive is realized, for example, by missionaries who have entrenched themselves in Israeli society, very often pretending to be Jews, getting involved in absorption centers. If you're going to tell me that the Messianic movement is just like, you have conservative reform, it's just, no, it's not Jewish at all. It's no different than the Assemblies of God with a meaningless overlay of Jewish customs and traditions. I have no problem saying that to people. We had a problem in Israel last year with God TV, right? It was nefarious. So my point is, if you scratch below the surface and somebody supports those kinds of activities, for my personal belief, keep your money. If you support us for legitimate reasons, then fine. But it's interesting, Jerry, how many people originally came at us with that perspective, but then learned. And I think my brother is very often responsible for that. When he addresses crowds with evangelicals, very often they'll call out verses they want him to cite, and Jonathan always says the same thing. Do you want me to recite what you think it says, or do you want me to tell you what it really says? And I've been at some of these events, and Jerry, they've never said, tell us what we want to hear. They say, we want to know what it really says. And that's where it begins. So again, I have a problem with agendas. And sometimes, the hidden ones are the worst, because if somebody's wearing it on his sleeve, you know what they're about. But if they don't, but see, the thing is, we have to educate ourselves, and we have to train ourselves to be able to educate others. And unfortunately, too many Jews don't know their own scripture, don't know their own heritage. And, why do you think there's a strategy they have? If they're trying to solicit Jews to join churches and stuff, if they, talk to somebody like me or you, they'll move on. They want to go for the low-hanging fruit who doesn't have any clue what their own scripture says. And I'm not embarrassed to say that. And I said it when John had a program that I wrote about with, what's his name, Pat Robertson. Somebody asked me what I thought, about Christian support of Islam. I said exactly that. And one of the evangelical guys who was there at the time, I think he's a friend of my brother, said, right on. So if I offend people, I offend people. I don't mean to. But my point is, I'm going to speak, it's a horrible phrase because it means so much when they say truth to power. But when it's a Jew speaking to a whole religious hierarchy that was devoted to crushing the Jewish spirit for 2,000 years. And I'm not letting Islam off the hook, by the way, because the idea that it was, gentler, no, it wasn't. The Rambam, Maimonides left the Iberian Peninsula not because of the Christians as bad as they were, it's because of the Almohad Muslims. Convert or die. So he went to, a more tolerant Muslim regime. But let's not forget, within Christendom, the Jews were invited into Poland. It was a haven for a century and a half before it turned to what. Amsterdam was a haven for Jews. So there were islands within Christendom where Jews could live unmolested. Same thing in the world of Islam. But the point is, we have only had ourselves that we could depend on. And that's what you're seeing. That's the long way of saying with the millennials, they no longer know that they have only themselves to depend on. And they seem to think that they can rely on political allies based on ephemeral cultural values that themselves are not Jewish.
On that note, I want to thank you for this brilliant discourse. And we look forward to more discussions of this type with you. And where can our readers find you?
I have a column or two a month in Israel National News, Arutz-Sheva, I'm reprinted for anybody down under the Jewish Report in Australia. The Sydney Melbourne Jewish Report seems to reprint my stuff. You've been very gracious in reprinting my stuff. Interestingly enough, years ago, I saw some links to my articles on around the web section on the Huff Post. When somebody started reading my stuff, I think they probably stopped putting my links in. And then I'm on the Zelda Young Show, usually between 9:10 and 9:35 Sunday mornings. And John usually does the last 10 minutes of that hour. And I'm on usually from 10 after 11 until noontime with a break in the middle on Wednesdays. And that's Chin Radio that streams live. So you can hear the shows live when they're being broadcast.
On that note, Hatzlacha. And we look
Rabbi.
All right, and we look forward to more.
Okay, well, it'll be a pleasure, Jerry. I enjoyed it, and I hope I wasn't too pedantic.
No, you didn't sound pedantic, I can tell you that much.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
Same here.